Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Learn with Jason. Today on the show, we are bringing in Ace Mark Erickson. How you doing?
Hey, doing pretty good.
I'm so happy to have you here. I think this is going to be so much fun. I'm really looking forward to it. And so, for folks who aren't aware of who you are, could you give us a little bit of a background on yourself?
Sure. My standard introduction to myself is I am an answer of questions. I will answer questions about React and Redux basically anywhere there is a text box on the internet. I collect any link that looks potentially useful or interesting, especially if it has to do with React or Redux. I write very, very long blog posts, mostly about React and Redux, but also things like using Git, keeping a daily work journal, stuff like that. And I am a Redux maintainer. I've written large portions of the Redux docs. I've worked on various portions of the Redux libraries. Also, I'm generally known as that guy with the Simpsons avatar.
It is a pretty notable avatar. I feel like it's one of the more consistent ones out there, right? Like I've seen that particular avatar for years. Actually, I have a question for you though. Mm-hmm. When you say very, very long blog post, how long is a very long blog post?
My average full-size post is 5,000 words and up. I've written some that are longer. My post on a mostly complete guide to React rendering behavior started out as 5,000 words, and then I've kept adding to it, and it's close to like 8,500 at this point.
Yeah, so you're writing books. I was kind of I always get crap from my team because I'm incapable of writing anything under 1,000 words, and my average is closer to 3. So you know, solidarity on Long Post Squad here.
Yep.
And thank you, Prismic. I saw you raid. Thank you so much. Welcome everybody. I hope you had fun on the Prismic stream. So okay, you're a maintainer of Redux. Let's maybe start just for folks who have maybe only heard Redux by name or are unfamiliar with it. What is Redux?
The docs say that Redux is a predictable state container for JavaScript applications. Perhaps a better way to describe it would be Redux is a pattern and a library for organizing global state in your application outside of the React component tree. Redux itself does not depend on any UI library, and you can use it with anything, React, Angular, Vue, whatever, but it's most commonly used with React. And the idea is that you provide a separation between the code that manages your data and updates it and the parts of your code that say, here's a thing that happened in my application. And this adds like a layer of indirection because you can't just say like state.x equals 123 in your click handler, but it does provide some useful benefits. And it's stuff like being able to look in one place to see how your state updating code actually works, and being able to trace when, where, why, and how your state actually updated. And one of the things that this helps with is Redux comes with a set of developer tools, mostly as a browser extension, and you can see the history of the things that happen, these events that we call actions, and how the state actually changed at each step along the way. So you can see what the state looked like at that time. You can see the diff in the state between previous and current. And the list of the action event types kind of tell you what kinds of things occurred. So the goal is to give you more confidence in understanding how the application is intended to behave and how it is behaving.
Okay. Yeah, and so like the thing that I remember really made Redux stand out back in the day when it first kind of showed up on the scene was this concept of time travel. And exactly. Everything that you just described is the reason that time travel is possible. You're not just making a change. You're creating these very well-defined steps that are, you can cycle through them forward and backward, which means that you're not just saying like my app changed and I don't know, people clicked a button and now stuff is different. You're very clearly defining like somebody clicked a button, this action occurred, we changed these things, and that happens in a stack so that I can say like, oh, well, if I just go back a step, then it's like unclicking the button. And if I go back another step, it's like unnavigating to this page. It's a really cool, I had never seen that before I had heard of Redux. And so, I mean, all of that sounds amazing. And it sounds like it's the sort of thing that makes web development, like this is the perennial problem in React, is we all say, how do we manage state in React? But for whatever reason, I've seen like there's been this kind of shift in sentiment where people have said like, well, but Redux is too much. It's too much boilerplate, right? What do you like? First of all, I know we're going to talk about how that's being addressed, but I guess the flip side to it is like, how do you think that came about in the first place? Like, what do you think led to that shift?
There's very good reasons for this. So even from the beginning, like some of the very early documentation, Dan Abramov actually said, like, Redux is not intended to be the shortest way to write code. It's meant to make your code predictable. And I've tried to divide this into what I refer to as inherent complexity and incidental complexity. So some of this is stuff that is more work because that's the way Redux was designed. Like I said, there's indirection. There's the process of having to define action objects and dispatch them and write your code separately. And for that matter, Redux expects that you update your state immutably, which means you have to make copies of all the different objects and arrays. And that's not how JavaScript works by default. So it takes more effort to make a copy of a thing than it does to say state.nested.field equals 1, 2, 3. On top of that, there were a bunch of different reasons people adopted Redux in 2015 and 2016. It was the best of the Flux libraries that came out at the time. And at the time, like, React didn't have a really good solution for avoiding the prop drilling problem, avoiding passing data through many layers of the component tree. So a lot of people chose Redux just to fix that problem. And since then, a lot of things have changed. React's new context API was purpose-built for avoiding the prop drilling situation. There are many other very, very good libraries in the ecosystem that solve some of the same kinds of problems that you can choose for Redux. But also, frankly, Redux was very overused. And it was the classic, like, if you have a hammer, everything you see is a nail. And like, once Redux got that initial adoption, everyone began writing tutorials saying, well, if you're using React, you have to be using Redux.
Yes.
It was added to a lot of applications that really did not need Redux in the first place.
And that actually kind of, that hits close to home for me, because where I started to feel like a resistance to Redux wasn't because of Redux. It was when everything that I was doing was like, it was Redux, but then I also needed to add a thunk, and then I also needed to add a saga, and I also and it was like, it feels like we're taking a long walk to make this stuff fit when we could just like not do that stuff and use this other pattern that, like, Redux wasn't built for the thing we're trying to use it for right now.
Right.
And that was where I started to be like, is this the right choice? Right. And it leads back to something that I think is kind of at the core of, I could say that it's experience, but maybe it's just getting tired, is starting to ask the question of like, are we actually using the tool that's going to get us there fastest?
Yes. And that's really been the biggest point I've been trying to make in these discussions over the last few years. I don't want everybody to use Redux. Redux is not the best tool for every situation. What I want is for people to take time to understand the trade-offs that the different available tools make, look at the actual problems that you have to solve in your own application, and try to choose the tool that best solves your specific problem. Yes. Now, related to that, like, most people, number one, most people don't take the time to think about any of this at all. But a lot of people don't know what the trade-offs are in each of these different tools.
Mhm.
As a quick side note, a couple months ago, I actually tried to get this idea off the ground where I've proposed a site that I'm calling the React Community Tools and Practices site. And the idea is that it should be like kind of like a shared documentation site, kind of inspired by the React TypeScript cheat sheet, where the
Okay.
community sits down and tries to assemble a list of common tools and practices that get used and provides like best faith descriptions of here's the problems each tool solves, here's when you might want to use it, here's when you should consider using something else.
Mhm.
Ideally written by an expert on each tool. So I threw up a repo, I started a discussion thread, there was a little bit of interest. I even created a prototype of the site and added like 2 pages on like what is state management and what is Redux. But I've been busy with a lot of other stuff and haven't had time to like go back and push it further.
Yeah, for sure. And I see David Korsheed's in the channel talking about making a PR, which would be about XState. And actually, you said something earlier that I want to call out because it actually reminded me of a conversation that I had with David about the idea of inherent. What did you say? Inherent complexity.
And inherent complexity, stuff that is built into the thing and cannot be avoided. That's how it works. Versus incidental complexity. It's like this is stuff that kind of comes along with it, but isn't necessary.
Yeah, and that reminds me of kind of a slightly different take on that David had about why, like, people are like, well, why does XState have so much code? And it's because you're explicitly defining the complexity that was always there.
Yep.
And so I think that is also a really interesting way to look at this, is that, you know, if we're talking about what is the boilerplate for? Well, the boilerplate is so that we're not guessing what's going to happen later. We're writing this code so that we can make things predictable.
Yes,
yeah,
and as that comment, okay, so that like that comment in chat right there is a good example of it.
Yeah.
Like every Redux tutorial you've ever seen up until about the last year or so, like uses a switch statement. Why do we use switch statements? Is because most Redux reducers are only interested in what the current value of the action.type field is. What is the most common control mechanism for looking at multiple values of one field? It's a switch statement.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do I have to do it? No. I could use an if else. I could use a lookup table. Just switch statements are sort of the most obvious way to do it, but it's not required.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's, yes, like getting the disambiguation between what is actually necessary and what is dogmatic about every tool is always, that's tricky, because, you know, when I also feel like there's this bell curve that I've seen about, like, when you're learning, you don't have a lot of opinions, and when you have a little bit of knowledge, you have a lot of opinions, and then as you get more experience, you have far fewer opinions.
Very true. Very true.
I think that what happens is a lot of people are at the top of that bell curve when they write their articles about tools, and so they're like, you must do it this way or else you're not doing it right, and I'll be angry and yell at you in the comments. And so I think that there's a certain sense of, like, by the time we've gotten the experience or you know, the wisdom to know that, well, it doesn't really matter. Like, you can build this however you want. Just make sure you understand the trade-offs. We're all so damn tired that we don't write the article.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I do think, like, I like the way you're coming at this, and I love the idea of that site to compare, like, you know, let's have the maintainers of these tools talk about, this is what it's built for and what it's ideal for, and this is this is when you should probably consider not doing it. I love that. Okay, so that is kind of the context. That's the history, what got us to today. But we're moving forward, right? So you've been working on some really exciting stuff that lets us keep all these benefits that we've been talking about, but reduces the boilerplate, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So there's a couple different pieces here. So one that some people have probably seen by now, in late 2018, React announced hooks, which allow function components to have state and write custom logic. And about 30 seconds after that announcement, people were filing issues in the React Redux repo asking, like, Redux hooks, when? And we had to go through some re-architecting of React Redux, and then we had like a multi-month, multi-hundred comment set of issue threads trying to design the API. But we launched our React Redux hooks API in summer of 2019. And the old Connect API is still there. It still works. Your code is not going to break. We're not going to remove that. But at this point, we now recommend using the hooks API as the default because it's, well, for one thing, it aligns with where React is going, but also it's just a lot simpler conceptually and code-wise. There's like Connect confused a lot of people. And while use selector and use dispatch do effectively the exact same thing, the way they look in the code just clicks with people.
Yeah. I do remember when I was at IBM, we used the Connect pattern, and that was always a hurdle for people was trying to get their head around how do like higher order components actually work, right? Because it feels like magic. You're like, okay, so wait, I wrote this function or I wrote this component and then it just gets magic props because what now? Like I wrapped it with what? And so you had to do this whole like whiteboarding exercise to explain how higher order components work. Whereas with hooks, I call a function and I get a dispatch. Yep. That makes sense.
And another nice benefit is that like TypeScript has taken over and we now recommend that people use TypeScript. And Connect is really, really hard to use with TypeScript. And use selector and use dispatch are basically trivial. It's just functions.
Mm-hmm.
So you just say, here's the argument, here's the result, done.
Yeah. I feel like one thing that I do like about TypeScript is that it has led to significantly less complex code because people have to type it.
Yeah, I wrote a post in late 2019 about my own experience learning TypeScript, and that was actually one of my takeaways, is that JavaScript is a very dynamic language. Sometimes capturing that in static types is hard. And so TypeScript kind of nudges you to not write really complex APIs in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like we could talk about this in the abstract for hours, but I would love to actually get my hands dirty with this. So I've never tried Redux Toolkit, so I'm really excited to try it out. So let's switch over here.
All right. Okay.
And so first, before we get started, remember this show, like every show, is being live captioned. We've got Whitecoat Captioning here with us today. Thank you so much for being here. And that is made possible by the support of our sponsors. We've got Netlify, Fauna, Auth0, and Hasura all kicking in to make this show more accessible to more people, which means a lot to me. Make sure you head to the homepage if you want to see those captions. And remember that these are clickable if you want to go check out the sponsors. Also, make sure you go follow Mark on the Twitter. Lots of good information about just the JavaScript ecosystem, more wisdom like he's been sharing for the last 20 minutes. So make sure you go and get joined up there. We are going to be talking about Redux Toolkit today. And specifically, I think we are, here's a kind of, this is the more of a migration guide, right?
Migration / comparison with the older way to write Redux code. Okay,
perfect. And I will leave the rest of these links for when we get to them. But so for now, if I want to get started, what's the first thing I should do as a raring to go Redux Toolkit hopeful?
Well, we actually have a pair of predefined templates for Create React App that actually come with both Redux Toolkit and the React Redux API already configured. So if you Create React App, My App, and we're actually going to be using something else today, but for most people, what you would do is Create React App, name of my app, -- template Redux, or -- template Redux TypeScript. Now, for today, we're going to actually show like kind of if we skip the predefined setup and actually add everything ourselves.
Yes.
How would this look like? And just for an added degree of difficulty, we're going to use something other than Create React App. We're going to use a similar tool called Vite. So Vite is kind of like Create React App, but it uses some different pieces inside. And Vite also has a command you can use to spin up a brand new project right away. And so while we don't have a Redux template for Vite, there is a React and TypeScript template for Vite that we can use to kickstart this project.
Okay. And so for me to do that, I'm going to use, let's see. So I'll do npm init Vite.js app, and then I want React TypeScript.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to call this, what did we call this episode? Let's learn
modern Redux.
You know what? We should probably call it something that'll show up in Google, right?
Yeah.
Redux Toolkit. And then we want to use the template, and the template that we want to use is React TS. Is that right? I
believe so. And in fact, I think if you don't supply the template, it actually gives you a prompt and asks you to select from a menu.
For real? Okay, let's do that because that sounds cool. I just want to see how it works. Wow, look at that. Okay, so let's do the React.
Yep. So pick React, and then it'll ask you which one you want. So TypeScript it is.
Excellent. That's super cool. Okay, so wait, what?
That was fast.
I thought it broke. Okay, so I'm gonna move. I am so blown away by just how, oh my god, how fast this stuff is. So let me get init this so it's not get ignored, and then we'll open it up. Okay, so I have a very bare bones looking site here.
Yep.
So here's our index.html. It's got a root that we're going to mount our React app into. What else is going on in here?
So it's really very, very similar to your typical create React app template. Really, about the only difference I saw was that the entry point file in this template is called main.tsx instead of index.tsx, but structure and content is otherwise basically identical.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I need to run my npm install.
Yep. And the nice thing here is that Vite has many fewer dependencies than Webpack and Create React App does, so there's actually a lot less to install here.
Yeah, look how fast that was. I mean, this is also something that I really enjoy is when look, oh my goodness, one scroll, one flick of the scroll wheel gets me all the way through Node modules. This one is not. This is not the heaviest object in the universe, it turns out. But okay, so looking at this, production dependencies, we've got React and React DOM. Dev dependencies, the types for React and React DOM, we've got the React refresh, which is going to let us. I assume that's what lets us reload when we save changes.
Yep.
TypeScript itself for compiling, and then Vite for building. Okay, I'm happy. All
right, so let's just start this in development just to see what we're starting with, and then we'll make some changes. So I believe npm run dev.
Beautiful. Gets going nice and fast.
Starts up instantly.
Yeah, so I'm just still blown away by how fast it is. Okay, so here's our simple default Vite project.
Yep. So let's go ahead and kill the dev server. And now let's go ahead, and then we're going to add some Redux packages to this. So let's add at npm I at redux.js/toolkit at next. We're going to install a beta version here.
Okay, and is it Redux.js no hyphen?
Correct.
Okay.
And then we'll also add in this command react-redux.
Okay. Anything else?
And yeah, let's add Axios as an HTTP library while we're at it too. We'll need that in a couple minutes.
Here we go.
Yep. Cool. Okay. So
I love the chat is talking about Edge. They called it Chrome in a hat. That's you're not wrong.
Nice.
I've been loving Edge. Have you been working with it at all?
No, I'm mostly a Firefox person for browsing and Chrome for daily development.
I was Chrome for daily dev until, for whatever reason, I have an older MacBook and it just started my processes spin out of control whenever I run Chrome now. So now I'm on Edge and I don't have that problem.
All right, so let's start by writing a bit of Redux logic. And like just about every tutorial ever, let's start by making a small counter example. I mean, the other option is to-dos, but let's start with a counter.
Okay.
So let's actually start by creating a new folder under source,
Okay.
and let's call it features. And this is something that is probably going to be different than what people have seen in Redux apps before, because typically you see like a set of folders named like actions, reducers, constants, all that kind of stuff. And that's never been required. Like Redux doesn't care about your file structure, but that was always the pattern we showed in our docs, was like a folder by type approach.
Gotcha.
And what we recommend today is more of a feature folder idea. Like you pick some concept in your application, and we're going to put all the code related to that feature in one folder, or occasionally even in one file. So let's create a folder named counter inside of here.
Okay.
Oh, so we would need to.
And inside of there, let's create a file called counterslice.ts.
Like that?
Hyphenated, camel case, doesn't matter. Whatever we got. Okay, so historically, you would have seen your Redux logic for one thing split across like 4 separate files for your action type, your action creator, your reducer, maybe like your component. What we recommend today is putting as much of the logic for a given feature as possible into a single file. And we typically refer to this as a slice file because it represents the logic and the data for one slice of your Redux state. You might have also heard this referred to as the ducks pattern.
Ducks, like ducks? Is it
like quack quack? It's a Redux joke that someone came up with.
I love it.
Okay, so the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to import a function and a type from the Redux Toolkit package.
Okay.
So we're going to import a function called createSlice. So curly braces, createSlice, comma, and a type called capital P payload action from @redux.js/toolkit.
Okay.
And if you're writing a Redux app, createSlice is the main API function you're going to use to define your Redux logic. And payload action is a TypeScript type that represents this is the contents of one given action object. So we're doing a counter here, and really all we need for our state is a number. But to make it a little more interesting, we're going to put that number inside an object. So let's define an interface called counterState.
Okay, interface counterState.
And let's just give it a single field called value that is a number.
Is that right?
Yep, value colon number semicolon.
Okay, I write very limited TypeScript, so I'm
sure. So this is going to represent the shape of the state inside of our slice that is managed by the reducer. Now, we also need to define the initial state for this slice. So let's do const initial state colon counter state.
Right.
So we're saying that this, let's add a colon counter state to say that is the type of this object equals new object value colon 0.
Got it. Okay.
So we have the type of our state, we have the initial value, and now we're going to define the slice that contains the reducer logic. So let's do const counter slice equals create slice.
Oh, and look at the autocomplete.
Yes, it's wonderful. So create slice takes one parameter, which is an object. And the first options field that we need to pass in is a field called name. And this is a string. And the slice is going to use this in a couple ways we'll talk about in a minute. So let's just call this counter.
Okay. Should it be uppercase, lowercase? Is there a convention?
Doesn't matter. I usually just do lowercase myself.
Okay.
And the next field is the initial state that this reducer is going to use. And we can use object shorthand to literally just say initial state, comma.
Okay.
And the third required argument is an object called reducers. And this is where we're going to define the different types of logic and updates that we're going to have inside this reducer. So what are the typical things that you can do with a counter? You can make it go up, you can make it go down, you can add some other amount to it, you can like reset it to 0. Let's start with the obvious simple one. We're going to want to have a case where every time an action is dispatched, we just add 1 to the counter.
Okay.
So let's make a function in here called incremented.
And do you have a preference? Like, should I do this syntax or?
Let's actually write it as an inline object function. So just the word incremented, parentheses with no spaces, state, comma, as an argument. And you know what? Actually, we don't even need an action in this case. So let's just backspace the comma there. So ES6 object literal syntax, you can define functions and objects without a separate function keyword or an arrow or whatever. So in a normal Redux reducer, what we would do here is like return ... state to make a copy of it for an immutable update, and then we would overwrite the value field with a old value plus 1. Redux Toolkit lets us simplify that process.
Okay.
So rather than doing that, we can write what looks like mutating code directly in this reducer.
Okay.
We don't even need a return keyword here. So all we actually have to write here is just state.value plus plus.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that one. I haven't used
4 plus equals 1. Same difference.
Yeah, no, this works.
So in a normal Redux reducer, this would be very bad because we're mutating our existing state. We're not making copies. The UI won't know anything's changed. The world falls apart, all that kind of stuff. But with Redux Toolkit, it uses a library called Immer. And Immer wraps our state updates, and it tracks all the mutations that we try to do. And once we're done, it actually kind of replays them and turns it into a safe and correct immutable update as if we'd done all that copying and spreading and mapping and everything ourselves.
Nice.
So this drastically shortens the amount of code we have to write.
Absolutely.
So let's hook up the rest of this, and we'll come back and add some more logic to this later. So let's scroll down below the counter slice.
Do the rest of this below the counter slice.
So typically with Redux, you see these things called action creators. And the idea is it's a function that makes and returns an action object. And typically you'd write those by hand. Create Slice actually just made one of those for us.
I'm just adding this note so that I don't forget later when I'm trying to explain it to somebody.
Documentation is a wonderful thing. So the typical pattern here, so this slice object has a couple of different fields in it.
Mm-hmm.
One is a reducer function that knows how to update this data for all the different cases we've defined. And it also has generated an action creator for each of the different functions inside the reducers field. So let's do export const, curly braces, incremented equals, so to the right equals,
I got you. Yeah, sorry.
Of there. Equals counter slice dot actions.
Okay.
And if we mouse over incremented, we should see a little TypeScripty pop up.
Ooh.
It says it is an action creator without a payload. And that's because our incremented reducer says we don't need an action object, so we really don't care about it. All we need to know is that something happened.
And it's smart enough to know if it doesn't have an action to just change the type.
Yep. So we'll look at another case of this in a few minutes after we set up the rest of the pieces. So after that line, we're going to export default counter slice dot reducer. Okay, so that is the basic shape of what we call a Redux slice. Use the create slice API, define what your state, one or more reducers to apply updates, export action creators,
Yes.
export the reducer that handles all those cases.
I mean, this is slick. And we're not using this yet, right?
We're not using it yet, so that's the next step. So now we need to set up our Redux store, which is a one-time thing per application. So the typical folder structure I use here is let's make a new folder under stores called app.
Okay.
And inside of there, let's make a folder called store.ts.
A file.
Yep. Did I say folder? I meant file. Yes.
Store.ts.
Yep. And we'll open that up, and we're going to import a function called configure store from Redux Toolkit.
Okay.
So this is a wrapper around the basic Redux create store function. It does the same job. It takes your reducer and makes a store, but it automatically sets up a store with the right defaults. For example, it automatically turns on the Redux DevTools extension, so you don't have to do this weird setup step yourself. It automatically adds the Thunk middleware, and it automatically turns on a couple of development checks that catch common mistakes like accidental mutations.
Interesting.
So
okay.
So now we need to import our counter reducer.
Oh wait, no, that's just counter reducer is the default.
Yep, it's the default, so no curly braces here.
From
/features
counter. Do we need to include the .ts in?
Nope.
Okay.
It should handle it automatically. Okay, so let's make our Redux store. So export const store equals configure store. And one thing you'll notice is that this also takes an options object as its parameter. So empty object. And we're going to add a field called reducer. And you could pass in an entire reducer function here, but you remember how Redux has that combine reducers function that lets you kind of mash a bunch of reducers together?
Mm-hmm.
Configure store will do that for us automatically if we pass an object. So let's pass another object here and a field called counter. And let's call the field counter and give it a value of counter reducer.
Gotcha.
And this will automatically call combine reducers so that we end up with a state.counter field in our state.
Nice.
While we're here, we're going to do a couple other very specific TypeScript things that are going to be important in just a minute. So go down a couple lines.
Okay.
We are going to export some types that are based on our store itself. So export type, and we're going to call this app dispatch. And this equals the type of store.dispatch.
Store.dispatch.
So we're taking the store's dispatch function and we're asking TypeScript, what is this thing? Well, it's a function that takes certain kinds of arguments, and we're exporting the type of that function as a thing we can use. Also, export a type called root state. And that equals, and this is going to be a little bit magical, TypeScript has a built-in type called return type, capital R, capital T, angle brackets, and then type of store.getState.
Like that?
And close angle brackets. There you go. So let's mouse over root state and see what TypeScript thinks that is. Oh, look, it's an object that has a field called counter that is the counter state.
That is dope. Okay. All right.
So there's nothing specific to Redux Toolkit about this. It's using TypeScript's inference to figure out as much as possible so that we don't have to declare this ourselves. And so if we add more slice reducers to our store, that type updates automatically.
Gotcha. That's slick. This is really nice.
All right, so we've got 2 more setup steps we need to do. Let's go over to main.tsx, and we're going to set up the React Redux provider so that the rest of our application can access the store.
Okay, let me make sure I have everything saved. I'm going to go to, you said main.tsx, and now we're going to get our, is it curly braces provider?
Yep, import curly braces provider from React Redux.
Okay.
And then we're going to want to import that store variable we just exported. So import curly braces store from ./app/store.
Okay. And then let's see if I can remember this. Provider store equals store. Not going to auto format for me? Fine. Okay.
It should. We don't have Prettier installed.
Oh no! Okay, no, it's fine.
How can we write this application without Prettier installed? Okay, so here's our typical one-time setup. Tell you what, let's go back to the browser. And do you have the Redux DevTools extension installed?
Not on this browser, but I can very quickly. Let's
add this real fast. This is like one of the first things I do on a new computer.
How do I do this on?
So let's see. Are we in Edge or Chrome here?
Yeah, I gotta install it here. Microsoft Edge, Redux DevTools.
I believe. Yep, there we go.
Okay. Done.
Okay, so let's restart our Vite dev server.
Unbelievable. Okay.
Refresh the page. Right-click anywhere, inspect element, because that's how I usually bring up the DevTools, or that works too. That button right there works fine. So if we look at the DevTools extension in here, we should see click on init on the left, and click on state on the right.
There it is.
And look, there's our counter state.
Beautiful.
Okay, so we've got the basic setup working, but there's one other thing we need to do before we can start using this in our components. So let's go back to that app folder. And let's make a new file called hooks.ts. And this is going to be a new pattern that we've recently started recommending for people who are using TypeScript.
Okay.
So React Redux has hooks, and there are TypeScript types that say how those hooks work. But those hooks don't know anything about the specific state or the dispatch capabilities in our own application. So what we found is that it's best to create predefined versions of those React Redux hooks that already know the right types for our state and our dispatch. Okay. So we're going to start by importing 3 things from React Redux. So start by doing Let's add the from React Redux, and then we'll fill these in because we get the import a little easier. The first one is capital T typed use selector hook.
Okay.
Second is the use dispatch hook. And the third is use selector.
That is much easier. I should remember to add the import name all the time.
Yeah, it's one of Python, the file names come first and then the imports, and I really wish ES6 had done that. So what we're going to do is we're going to define pre-typed versions of use dispatch and use selector. So let's do export const use app dispatch equals arrow function implicit return. Skip the curlies. And we're going to do use dispatch angle brackets for a generic type. And now, we actually need to import those 2 types from our store file. So let's go back up a line. My bad, I forgot a step. So import from /store, and let's import the root state and app dispatch types.
So I'm guessing use dispatch is going to be app dispatch.
Correct.
Okay.
And then the next line is export const use app selector. And then before the equal sign, we want a colon. And the type here is typed use selector hook angle brackets root state. And then this equals use selector, but with no parentheses.
Got it.
There
So
we go.
this is a bit where, let me repeat this back to make sure I understand, because this is a function.
Yes.
But what we're doing is we're aliasing it, but adding types.
Exactly.
Okay, I understand.
So now we are exporting two hook variables that have the right TypeScript types defined. And in our components, we're going to import these hooks from the hooks file instead of importing the base functions from React Redux.
Gotcha.
Okay, so let's go add this to the UI real fast. So let's open up our app.tsx file.
Okay.
And we could write this as a separate component, but for simplicity, let's skip it. Oh, hey, look, conveniently, this template already has a counter example in here. I actually forgot about this. So this is great. Actually, this is perfect. So right now, the counter is driven by React State. So let's import those two hooks from our hooks file up top. So import from /app/hooks.
And then we want use and use selector.
Yep.
Okay.
And then we're also going to want to import the incremented action creator from our counter slice file.
Okay, so features counter slice, and we want incremented action. Wait,
Yep.
Yeah,
That's
right.
Yep, that's it. Okay, so let's delete the line with the use state.
Okay, get rid of the use state.
So the first thing we want to do is grab the current value of the counter so we can display it. So we're going to do const value equals use app selector, and this takes a selector function. And we could write it separately, or we can write it inline. So we'll just do it inline.
Okay.
So it takes one argument, state. So state arrow function.
And we just want state value. State.counter.value.
State.counter.value. And now you see the usefulness of having this pre-typed.
Yes.
We didn't have to say that state was a root state. That's already built in, and we get all the nice autocomplete and everything.
And I should actually show that. Is we can see here, I didn't have to actually guess, which I did. So instead, I could have just been patient, hit the dot, and then seen counter was there, and then hit dot again and seen the value was there. So it saves me from myself.
Yep. So if we mouse over value, we should see on the left that it's a number.
Mm-hmm.
Over on the left side,
on the left, yes.
The extracted one.
Got it.
So we should be able to, even to be consistent, let's actually call that count, because we're already inserting a variable called count in our output.
All right, that'll match it.
Yep.
Oh, look, now we got our types down here. Heyo.
Yep. And let's just temporarily remove the on-click handler just so it compiles and runs.
Okay.
So just delete the whole on-click prop.
Get it out of there.
Okay. And let's hit save, and the page should auto reload.
Yep.
Just for kicks, let's go back to our counter slice file. Let's just change the initial value to like a 5 or 10. Yep, there we go. So that's that's proof that the data is coming from the Redux store to the component. So it's a button. What do we do with buttons? We increment things when we click on them. So now we want to dispatch that incremented action.
Right.
With the old Connect API, we would have kind of abstracted this by using the map dispatch argument and getting dispatch wrapped action creators as props. With the use dispatch hook, we've removed that abstraction. So you write a little more code, but it's more obvious what's happening. So we're just going to get dispatch itself. So const dispatch equals use dispatch.
Use app
dispatch. Thank you. And what happens when we mouse over that variable? Call the hook, mouse over it. Oh, it's a fancy, complicated.
But it's got
dispatch.
the counter in there. Look at it go. Okay. Yep. All right.
So now we have access to dispatch. We need to make our click handler. So let's go back to the button, add the onClick.
I'm gonna put it up here. Let's do.
We can totally separate it out. So const handle click equals or function, whatever your preferred syntax is.
Okay, and so down here, then this is just going to be handle click, and we don't really need to worry about the event because we're not preventing anything, so we can just jump right in here, right?
Yep. So all we're going to do in here is dispatch parentheses. And we're going to dispatch whatever is returned by that incremented action creator. So just incremented parentheses.
And that's it?
That should be it. So let's hit save and let's start clicking buttons.
Ah, look at this. Okay.
Clickety.
Now, but look. So now you look at the thing. We can see here's our time travel. Now I'm going to jump. Oh my goodness, we're time traveling, everyone.
Yep. And you notice that we have the word counter in the action types and also the word incremented. Where did those come from?
That is
if you look at that counter slice file, this is where the name of the slice comes into play. It automatically generated those action type strings you used to write by hand by just combining the slice name field with the literal name of the case reducer function that we wrote. So you just give your functions obvious names and you get the action types and stuff for free. You don't have to do anything special.
This is slick. This is really, really nice.
Okay, let's do one more quick thing right here to demo stuff, and then we'll move on, especially because we're burning through time. Let's say we want to add a specific number to our existing value. So let's add a second case here in the slice called amount added or something. So just below incremented. Let's
just
add
below incremented, amount added. Gotcha. And this one's going to take an action, right?
Correct. So same state.
And that's the payload action.
Yep. So payload action, angle brackets, number. And that. And
gotcha. Number.
So angle brackets right there. So that's saying that when we get this action object, the payload field is going to be a number. And just like anything else, like it could be an object, an array, a string, whatever, just like for this case, it's a number. Well, what are we going to want to do? We're going to want to add that to the existing value. So now let's do state.value plus equals action.payload.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Okay. So then for me to do this, then I would just
we need to export the action creator that just got generated.
Got it. Okay. So let's export that amount added. And then in my hooks, I don't need to do anything. In my store, I don't need to do anything. So I just go back here.
Yep.
And
import. So import amount added. And let's make a second handler, or we could do this. Yeah, let's just add some known amount to it. That works.
So we'll increment by 3 here, and so it should go up by 3s. 3, 6, 9, perfect.
There you go. So that's the basics of writing slices with Redux Toolkit and TypeScript. You define an initial state and the type. You define the case reducers, And for every action object that one of those reducers takes, you use the payload action type to say, here's what's inside of the action.payload field.
Excellent.
So that's the basics of what we call modern Redux. It's React Redux hooks. It's Redux toolkit for the store setup and the logic. It's the newer patterns that we recommend, like writing these slice files to put the logic in one place, using TypeScript, exporting the type hooks. All that together, it's the same Redux that we've always had, but the code you write is so much different than it would have been just a couple years ago.
Yeah. I mean, you can see, like, so we're increment by 1 if we use this one, increment by fixed amount. This like, having written a lot of Redux code, I can see how much of a difference this will make in like modern applications. Yep. So this is a huge leap forward. I mean, like, excellent work here. This is really great.
Okay, so in the interest of trying to get to the thing that I really want to show before we wrap this up, let's take a quick look at a couple bits of docs. We'll skip the middle section that I was hoping to have us do, but I'll talk about it real fast.
Okay.
And then we'll skip ahead to the final section. So if we go to that Redux Fundamentals Part 8 docs page, and we look at the writing thunks section there kind of in the middle. So we've always encouraged the use of a code pattern called thunks for writing our asynchronous logic. And thunk is a middleware that lets the store accept a function as a dispatched thing. And it's basically a way that let you write logic that talks to a store ahead of time, separate from your components, without knowing what store it's going to talk to. And so it gives you access to dispatch and get state, and then it kind of says, do something with it, have fun. And so typically we would write asynchronous logic in thunks. And the standard pattern that we've taught is that you would dispatch an action before you make an AJAX request, make the request, and then dispatch a success or failure action based on how the request resolves.
Right.
And the idea is you would track like a loading state field so that you can show like your spinner or an error message or something like that. So Redux Toolkit has an API called Create Async Thunk that is meant to handle that specific pattern of dispatch before, make a request, dispatch success or failure afterwards. So real fast, let's just look at a code example here. So if you scroll up slightly, at the top of this code block, it shows what create async thunk looks like. It takes 2 arguments. The first one is a partial action type string. This is like the one place where you would still write those. And it's actually going to generate 3 new action types based on that. One for pending, one for fulfilled, and one for rejected.
Gotcha.
The second argument is a function that is going to make some kind of an async request. In this case, let's say we have a little abstraction layer around like fetching some to-dos from a server. So we're going to make the request, await it, and then return a field that was in the response. Create Async Thunk will automatically define 3 different action creators and action types, and it will automatically dispatch pending before this function runs. It will run the function and then dispatch either the fulfilled or rejected actions depending on how the result resolved. And so in our slices, because we've defined this thunk outside of create slice itself, we need a way to respond to these other action types that aren't part of the slice.
Right.
So we can use this extra reducers field, and it's got this builder callback API inside. And so I can say, hey, builder, I want to listen for the action type associated with the thunk.pending action creator. And inside of there, I can say, well, here's our action. And when the pending action is dispatched, I want to update the status field to loading. And when the result comes back and it dispatches the fulfilled action, then I want to take the data that I got back from the server, maybe reformat it a little bit, assign, update the state to contain that data, and I want to reset my status flag. So create async thunk simplifies some of the common patterns for working with AJAX requests and dispatching actions and thunks that we've always recommended. Exact same pattern, exact same behavior, just a little less code. But honestly, even with create async thunk, you still have to write the thunks, you still have to write the reducers, you have to manage the loading state.
Right.
And it's still kind of a pain. And what we've seen over the last few years is that the React ecosystem in particular has shifted from this idea of state management as the problem space to focusing on server data fetching and caching. And this is where like libraries like React Query and Apollo and Urkel and SWR have become very popular. And they've all sort of converged on some similar APIs and patterns. It's like users don't want to write thunks and reducers and loading state to manage fetching data. They just want to say like, here's my URL, magically get it for me and give me back like an is loading flag in my data field. And then I can render my spinner or the list or whatever when it comes back.
Right.
And so you can use Redux for doing that, but you have to write all the code yourself until now. So my co-maintainers, Lenz Weber and Matt Sikowski, have been building a new Redux-based data fetching abstraction on top of Redux Toolkit. And it takes very obvious inspiration from libraries like React Query and Urkel and Apollo and SWR. So if we look at the RTK Query docs page over there, this is our beta preview docs. You can see it's still a deploy preview. But the idea is that Redux Toolkit in its upcoming release will have an additional API section that provides this data fetching abstraction built specifically for Redux. And it's going to have some very unique properties. Like since Redux and Redux Toolkit don't care about your UI, you can reuse RTK Query with any UI layer, React, Angular, Vue, Svelte, Vanilla.js. But we also actually have some React-specific behavior where we will auto-generate React hooks for the API endpoints that you define.
No way. Okay.
So what we're going to try to quickly do in the remaining few minutes here is we're going to try to set up RTK Query in our application, and we're going to fetch a list of some dogs.
Okay. So we've got dogs as a service here ready to go.
Dogs as a service. All right.
Brings me a lot of joy.
So I've already created an API key that we'll need to add into our code base here. But let's go back to our code.
All right. So what I'm going to do is let me try to get this API key. How do we make it available to Vite, right? Do we need to?
It's like we're going to actually paste it into the code somewhere.
Oh, okay. So it's okay if it's public?
Yeah. I mean, I just created it off their free tier. If 1 million people start using it, maybe they'll yell at me, but I made it for this demo. So who cares?
All right. Okay.
So let's inside our features folder, let's create a folder named dogs.
Okay. New folder, dogs, and a dog slice.
And let's call it like dogs API slice, just to be a little more clear. Again, it's just naming, it's just files. Call it whatever you want.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and paste that API key in this file, just so we've got it available.
Oops. Okay.
Okay, and let's go up a couple lines, and we're going to import a couple things from this beta version of Redux Toolkit. So we actually have this available as a nested import. So it's redux.js/toolkit/query/React.
Ooh, nice. Okay.
So this is an optional add-on. You don't pay for it unless you import it. And we're going to import two things: a function called create API,
You hackers, you dirty hackers.
and another method called fetch base query.
Got it.
Okay, so now we need to define the expected data type that we think we're going to be fetching back from this API. So let's make an interface called breed, because the API endpoint we're going to be hitting is different types of dogs.
Right.
First two fields are ID string and name string. And then it's got a nested object called image, which has a field called URL that is a string.
Okay.
Okay, so let me double check what we got here. So we are going to define what we refer to as an API slice. And the idea is you're probably only going to have one or two of these in your entire application. Like, let's say you've got like a typical server that has, blog post example, endpoints for users, posts, and comments. You would not define separate API slices for each of those. Instead, you would define one API slice for the base server.
Gotcha.
And then you were going to define different endpoints inside of that for each of the different sub URLs that we would hit. So let's create const dogs API slice equals
const API slice equals
create API, and this also takes an object. And the first parameter this needs is a string field called reducer path.
Okay.
And this is going to help the code know when we attach this to our Redux store, where are we keeping the data in the reducers? So let's just call this as a string of API.
Okay.
All right, the next argument is we need to tell this, how are we going to fetch our data? Now, there's many libraries and things that we can use to do fetches. There's the fetch API built into browsers. There's APIs like Axios and other stuff. People write their own wrappers around fetch. RTK query comes with its own built-in fetch wrapper called fetch base query. So we're going to define a base query field.
Okay.
And we're going to call fetch base query.
Okay.
And pass in an object with a couple more options. And the first parameter is the URL that we're going to hit as the basis for this API. So base URL, and it's quote https://api.thedogapi.com/v1.
Okay.
And because this wants some authentication, we're going to need to add our API key as a header. So let's add a prepare headers field that is a function.
Oh, prepare headers?
Yep.
Prepare headers. There it is. Okay, that's a function.
The parameter here is a value called headers.
Headers.
And we are required to return the headers object from the function.
Okay.
And before that, what we're going to do, just return headers.
Oh, gotcha. Return headers.
And then before that, we're going to set a header. So headers.set.
Name. And so this one is
x-API-key lowercase.
And then we'll pass in our dogs API key.
Yep.
Okay.
So that sets up what server we're talking to and passes through the auth header so that it knows that, hey, we're allowed to make this request.
Okay.
So if you've looked at like React Query or SWR, RTK query works a little bit differently. Like React query expects that you're going to pass in a fetching function when you use the hook in your component. And that's typically where you would specify the URL. RTK query takes an approach where we want you to try to define the expected endpoints up front as part of this structure. So we're going to add a field called endpoints. And this is also a function that takes a builder parameter.
Builder?
Yep.
Okay.
And we're going to return an object inside of here. And the fields in this object are going to be endpoint definitions generated by that builder. And I see someone asking, can RTK work with Angular? Yes, because RTK is plain JavaScript and not dependent on any UI library. And in fact, there's even someone who's been putting together an RTK query plus NGRX integration package that works the same way our built-in React hooks integration works.
That's slick.
Okay, so we're going to define an endpoint field called fetch breeds.
So just like fetch breeds, like so?
Yeah, it doesn't even need quotes. And the value here is we're going to call builder.query. And we need to pass in some angle bracket generics here to say what is the return type of the API response, and what are the arguments that we're going to pass in to the parameter generation function we'll add in a minute. Okay. So the return type is going to be an array of breeds.
An array of breeds. And so do I just do it like that?
Yeah, breed square bracket.
Oh, breed square bracket. Okay. I forget how. Yep. Okay.
Comma. And then our parameters function that we're going to set up in a minute is going to take an optional number as its parameter. So number pipe void.
Number pipe void. Okay.
Close angle brackets, parentheses, open object. And we're going to pass in one field in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up some query. We need to say which of the nested endpoints at the server are we going to hit. And we're going to need to define a query parameter so that we limit the number of responses that come back. So we're going to add a field called query.
Got it.
And this is going to accept that optional number as its parameters. This is a function.
Oh, no, sorry.
Yep, that's fine. So let's call the parameter limit.
Okay.
Let's make it default to 10. So limit equals 10 as a default argument. And we are going to return a template string.
Okay.
And inside of here, we're going to return /breeds, question mark for the parameter. And then we're limit equals $ curly braces limit. So we're constructing the remainder of the path plus the query parameters based on the argument right here.
And this is smart enough to know that it, like the base query sets us up here. And so every query that we make is going to be the dogapi.com/v1/breeds, and it will pass this header.
Yep. Okay.
Slick. Okay.
So the part we've done so far is all common whether or not we're using React. And if we weren't using React, it actually generates a reducer and some thunks and some logic that we're going to need as part of our setup. So we need to do a couple more things here. Let's export. Actually, let's just slap an export on line 13 in front of the API slice.
Got it.
And let's go back to our store file.
Here's our store. And it's going to be dog API. What did we export it as?
Dog API from dot features dogs API slice. So it's the Oh,
Oh,
yeah, we named exported it.
So it's going to be API slice from features dogs
Yep.
dogs API slice. Okay, and
Okay,
then
now, so we need to do two things here. We
Okay.
need to add the reducer to our store.
Mhm.
So let's add, we actually conveniently have the field that we described earlier. So let's go down a line and do square brackets. And let's do API slice dot reducer path.
Oh, I got it. Okay.
And I'm trying to double check something on my side, and I'm actually getting some TypeScript errors. So I'm afraid I'm about to break something, but we'll
I don't just put in the reducer like this.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay.
And the other thing we need to do to really make this work entirely correctly is we need to add the custom generated middleware that is part of the slice to the store.
Okay.
So there we go. So let's go down a line. So RTK's configure store simplifies the process of adding middleware to our setup. So we're going to go with the middleware field.
Got it.
And this is going to be a callback function.
Okay.
And the name of the parameter that it takes is called get default middleware.
Okay. Did it just import that?
It did, but we actually want to remove that. It's an export that one of these days we actually need to get rid of because we changed how it's used.
Okay.
So get default middleware arrow. We want to return call get default middleware by itself. And that's something that actually normally happens internally. But now we're going to expand that and add another middleware after it. So we're saying the combined middleware is everything by default plus this. So now we're going to say .concat
Okay.
API slice dot middleware.
API slice dot middleware.
Yep.
Got it. The chat is
And-
very excited about dogs.
And this is going to actually add some special capabilities that will be able to track things like cache lifetimes. Like if no other part of the code base needs this data, we can remove it from the cache after it expires.
Nice. Okay.
Okay, so we've got like 10 minutes left. We can do this.
We can do this.
Okay, let's go back to our dogs API slice file.
Got it.
There's something really cool we can do here. Let's go down to the bottom of the file. And we're going to do export const, and let's do some empty curly braces because we're going to come back in a second.
Okay.
Equals API slice on the right.
Okay.
And now inside of the curly braces, let's bring up our autocomplete. If there should be something called use fetch breeds query in the middle.
That is
Select that.
extremely cool that just happened.
Where did that come from? Well, we said that we have an endpoint called fetch breeds. And the kind of thing that we're doing is a query request to fetch data.
Wow.
You can also do a mutation request to post and update data. And this actually automatically generated a new React hook by combining the names here.
That's extremely cool that just worked.
So it literally took the name fetch breeds, combined it with query, and made a hook called use fetch breeds query. And if we mouse over it, it's probably gonna the types are probably gonna look ugly, but we should see
it returns back the breed.
It returns
yeah.
a breed. It takes an optional number. It's got all the TypeScript stuff encoded in there.
Yeah. That's really, really cool. Okay.
So let's go fetch some dogs. Let's go back to our app component.
Okay. I'm ready. Let's fetch some dogs. So
Okay. Let's just delete. Yeah. So let's go import the hook.
we're gonna go features. Nope. /features. Dogs API slice. And I'm assuming that I want the use
Yep.
fetch breeds query.
Yep.
Okay.
Let's just delete all the counter related stuff entirely.
Because I'm gonna put this example up.
Okay,
Let's just put it below.
Yeah. Okay. So let's so below here, or anywhere in here, const empty object equals.
Use fetch breeds query.
Yep.
And my limit, I can leave it at 10.
We can ignore it for now.
Okay.
And let's inside the object, let's grab data, comma is fetching. And let's mouse over data for a second.
It's beautiful.
Oh, look,
it's beautiful.
It's breed or undefined.
Yes.
So that means that, like, hey, if we haven't fetched the data yet, it's not there. So let's be good safe coders and let's fill in an empty array as the default. So equals empty array right after data.
Okay.
And let's throw a couple things. Let's replace that paragraph. And let's throw in two things.
Okay.
First off, let's do empty div, and let's say number of dogs fetched.
Then we could do like data.length.
Exactly. So this will tell us how many came back in the request, which should be related to how many we asked for.
You're right.
But we'll see this. Next line down. Let's do our table dance. So new empty table.
Oh, we're doing a table. All right. Okay. Let's do a table. Let's do a table.
Yep. Table, T head, and T body.
Oh boy, haven't written okay. Speed run on writing tables.
Yep.
Then we've got is it TH?
TR inside the header.
TR.
We're gonna be correct here.
TH.
TH, and let's do title of name.
Name.
And then another for picture.
Okay.
And then down inside of our T body, let's open it up. Data.map. And we've got breed as our parameter.
Breed.
And then we can do
TR.
implicit inherits. Yeah. TR key is dog.id.
Let's see. Key is breed.id, right?
Breed.id. I had dog in my example earlier, so I'll be consistent here.
We'll go TD.
Yep.
And then
TD,
we get
dog.name.
And look at this beautiful autocomplete that we're getting here. Or I guess I need to like actually get inside some valid JavaScript to get it. But look, beautiful. All right. And then TD. This one I need to make an image, right?
Yep. Let's grab some image in here.
And we'll call this one breed.image.
So it's breed.image.url as the source.
Oh, that's right. This one needs to be a URL.
Yep, and let's give it a height parameter of 250 for consistency.
What am I doing? Where is it?
Dot URL.
There it is. Trust the TypeScript. Okay. And you want a height of 250.
Yep.
Okay. So
Crossing fingers. Crossing fingers.
Crossing fingers. Crossing toes. Oh, beauty.
Dogs!
Look at these dogs. And look, we defaulted to 10, right? So let's see what happens if we up this. And we'll do a query for, we wanted fetch breeds query of,
let's just make it 5 or 20 or whatever.
More dogs.
Yep.
More dogs.
Let's do one more thing really fast.
Okay.
Let's make this dynamic.
Okay.
So let's add another div right above number
bucket.
of dogs fetched.
Okay.
And we'll call this add a text description of dogs to fetch, and we're going to drop a select in here.
Okay.
Okay. And we're actually also going to want to add okay, so let's go back up one. We're going to add another use state real fast. Same as the counter, but let's call it numdogs and set numdogs.
Okay.
So const brackets numdogs set numdogs.
Numdogs. Reminds me of Updog.
Mm-hmm. Use state 10. Back to our select.
Back to our select.
Value equals numdogs inside the select. On change equals.
Wait, am I doing?
No. Back up. Let's see. So we want the value equals numdogs on the select itself. And then the options are going to be the different things we can choose. So then on change on the select. Parentheses E arrow function set numdogs, and because this is a string, we have to numberify it. So capital number.
Is it dot value?
E dot target dot value.
Dot target dot value.
Yep. And then we're gonna make 4 options, and their values are going to be string numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do 5, 10, 15, 20. And let's give them literal text descriptions of 5, 10, 15, 20.
Okay. 10, 15, and 20. And I screwed that up by doing what?
Good
value.
question.
Oh, I have these
rogue. Yep, extra curlies.
There we go. Okay, so now we've got 10, 5.
Okay, so let's
fix.
There's one other thing we need to do. We need to pass the state value as the limit parameter. So pass numdogs there.
Okay.
Now let's try it and see if it works.
Number of dogs fetched is 10.
Okay. One more cool thing. Bring up the network tab in the browser's DevTools. And let's actually refresh the page.
Refreshing?
Yep, refresh the page.
Okay.
Go to XHR on the network tab, and let's filter the list by breed.
Okay. I think that's all we got right now.
Yeah, so now go to 5.
Okay.
And we fetched that. Now go back to 10.
Heyo.
Wait a minute. We didn't fetch anything. Why didn't we fetch anything? Because we already have the data in cache. Go to the Redux DevTools. And let's look at this really fast. Click on the state tab on the right side. Here's how we're storing the data. The API slice caches the data for every unique combination of endpoint plus query params.
That is so smart.
We've got the data for the fetch params 10 case. We've got the data for the fetch params 5 case. And when we switched, it said, well, I'll leave the data here for a little while longer in case anybody else needs it.
Mm-hmm.
And if we had like 5 components that all need that data, it's kind of like a reference count. It says, well, 5 things need that data, 4 things need it, 3 things need it, 2 things, 1. Nobody needs it anymore. Set a timer. 1 minute later, look. Nobody needs it. Go away.
And it just did it. It just did a cleanup where it removed the 5 because we haven't used it in a while.
Yep.
Good. I love it. That's beautiful. So unfortunately, we're out of time. So we
got it done. We
got it done. I mean, this is beautiful. I love this. So we'll get this example up online. Where should somebody go if they want to learn more?
Okay, so right now, the Redux Toolkit query docs are in a preview PR that is linked from our beta release notes. The logic is basically done. We've got 1 or 2 more little tweaks to do, and then a little more documentation left to write. It would actually be the Redux Toolkit repo.
Redux Toolkit.
Yep. We are hoping to have this live in Redux Toolkit version 1.6 soon. It'd be nice within the next couple of weeks, at which point it would be part of the Redux Toolkit documentation specifically.
Got it.
So
cool.
Our goal is that existing Redux users can use this to drastically simplify your data fetching logic. And this would sort of be the mostly recommended way to do data fetching in Redux going forward.
Beautiful.
And even people who aren't using React can still use this.
Awesome. All right, well, let's do this. So we're out of time. So everyone, make sure you go and follow Mark on Twitter. If you've got questions, fire them off there. You also make sure you go and check out Redux Toolkit. This has been a really enlightening episode. I am very excited about this and all the things we can do with it. As always, this episode has been live captioned. We've had White Coat Captioning here with us all day, and that's made possible by Netlify, Fauna, Auth0, and Hasura, all of whom kick in to make this show more accessible to more people. While you're on the homepage of the site, make sure you head over to our schedule and check out what's coming next. We've got really, really good stuff coming up. Marcy Sutton's coming on next week. We've got Tamaj Lakami coming on. Look, so many people, Ben Myers and more. I still have to update this with all the great people who are coming. Mark, any parting words before we call this thing done?
I'm really excited about where Redux and the ecosystem are going. Remember, you don't have to use Redux. Only use Redux if it solves your problems. But I think we've improved it in a way that it does solve more problems than it used to.
Absolutely. All right, chat. With that one, we're going to call this one done and in the can. Thank you so much for hanging out with us today. Mark, thank you so much for spending time with us. We will see you all next time.
Thanks. Appreciate it.